There are certain memories from childhood that never quite leave you, not because they were dramatic, but because at the time they felt completely ordinary, woven so tightly into everyday life that nobody ever thought to question them. In Britain, especially in the decades after the war, discipline was not something discussed or negotiated, and it certainly wasn't something explained to children in calm voices around the kitchen table, because discipline was simply what happened when you stepped out of line, when you answered back, when you embarrassed the family, or when you were judged to have forgotten your place. Back then, parents didn't talk about boundaries, emotional regulation, or child psychology because those ideas barely existed in ordinary homes, and instead, discipline was framed as character building, respect enforcing, and necessary for survival in a hard world. If you grew up in Britain during that period, some of these will feel uncomfortably familiar, and if you didn't, you may struggle to believe they were ever considered acceptable at all. Before we begin, if these kinds of forgotten everyday realities resonate with you, consider subscribing or leaving a comment later on, because the stories people share underneath these videos often say just as much as the video itself. Now, let's begin. Number 1. Being hit with objects because hands weren't enough. For many British children back then, physical punishment did not always come in the form of a hand, because hands were sometimes seen as too soft, too personal, or simply ineffective when a lesson really needed to be learned. Instead, discipline often involved whatever object happened to be nearby, whether it was a slipper taken from a foot, a wooden spoon lifted from the kitchen drawer, a belt unthreaded slowly from its loops, or even a ruler picked up deliberately for that exact purpose. What made this especially disturbing by today's standards is how normalized it was, not spoken about in whispers, not hidden away, but treated as a practical solution to disobedience, something parents openly admitted to using, often with the justification that it hurt less than what they themselves had endured as children. There was rarely any sense that this crossed a line, because pain was framed as temporary, forgettable, and ultimately beneficial, a way of teaching children consequences without what adults considered real harm. And the most unsettling part is that children themselves often accepted this logic, believing that if they had behaved better, it would not have happened, internalizing responsibility for the punishment rather than questioning the act itself. Today, the idea of striking a child with an object is widely recognized as abuse, but back then, it was simply called discipline, spoken in the same tone you might use to describe sending a child to their room or taking away a privilege. Number 2. Being locked out of the house as punishment. In many British neighborhoods, particularly in working-class areas, the home was not always a place of refuge, because for some children, it could be taken away entirely as a form of correction. Being locked out of the house, sometimes for hours at a time, was a punishment used to enforce obedience, reflection, or submission, with parents believing that time spent outside would cool tempers and teach respect. Children would sit on front steps, lean against garden walls, or wander the street until someone decided they had learned their lesson, regardless of the weather, the time of day, or how frightened they might have been. This was not seen as neglect, but as a firm boundary, a reminder that the house belonged to the parents, and that access to warmth, safety, and comfort was conditional on good behavior. What makes this shocking now is not just the physical danger, but the emotional message it sent, that belonging itself could be withdrawn, and that home was something you could lose if you failed to comply. Today, locking a child out would immediately raise safeguarding concerns, but back then, neighbors rarely intervened, because they recognized it as a familiar method of discipline rather than a reason to step in. Number 3. being physically dragged or held down until you complied. Physical force did not always leave visible marks, but it was often used nonetheless, especially when a child resisted instructions or refused to do what they were told. Many children remember being grabbed by the arm, pulled down hallways, lifted from one room to another, or physically restrained until they stopped struggling, crying, or protesting. This was not framed as violence, but as necessary control, a way of reminding children who was stronger, who was in charge, and who ultimately decided how things would unfold. Parents did not apologize for this, nor did they explain it, because physical dominance was seen as part of parental authority, something children needed to accept rather than question. From a modern perspective, forcibly restraining a child in this way is deeply troubling, particularly when it is used to silence rather than protect. But at the time, it was rarely challenged, because children were expected to submit, not to be heard. What lingers for many adults looking back is not the pain, but the sense of helplessness, the realization that resistance was pointless, and that obedience was the only way to make it stop. Number 4. Threatening serious harm and fully meaning it. One of the most powerful tools in the discipline arsenal was not physical punishment itself, but the promise of it, delivered calmly and deliberately, often with a phrase that many still remember word for word. Wait until your father gets home. This was not an empty threat, not a figure of speech, but a statement designed to instill dread, because children knew exactly what it implied, and they knew there would be no discussion when that moment arrived. Fear was used strategically, stretched over hours, sometimes an entire day, allowing anxiety to build as a lesson in obedience long before any punishment was carried out. Parents believed this anticipation was effective, that it reinforced authority without immediate action, and that it taught children to regulate themselves through fear of consequences rather than understanding of rules. Today, deliberately using fear as a disciplinary strategy is widely criticized for its long-term emotional impact, but back then, it was considered efficient, practical, and entirely appropriate. Children were not expected to feel safe all the time because safety was seen as something earned through good behavior, not something guaranteed. Number 5. Deliberate public humiliation. Discipline did not always happen behind closed doors, because for many parents, shame was an effective way to correct behavior quickly and permanently. Children might be told off sharply in front of visitors, criticized at the dinner table, or mocked openly in front of siblings, cousins, or neighbors, all under the belief that embarrassment would discourage repetition. This was not accidental, nor was it impulsive, but a deliberate choice to make an example of a child, reinforcing not just parental authority, but social expectations. The message was clear. Misbehavior did not just affect the child, but reflected on the family, and public correction ensured that lesson was understood. Today, deliberately humiliating a child is recognized as emotionally damaging, but back then it was often seen as preferable to physical punishment, a non-violent way to enforce discipline while still leaving a lasting impression. Many adults now recall these moments as more painful than any physical punishment because shame lingers far longer than a slap, embedding itself deeply into a child's sense of self. Number 6. Enforced silence as punishment. Silence was often used as a tool of control, particularly when parents wanted to assert authority without raising their voices or resorting to physical force. Children could be told not to speak, not to answer back, or not to engage at all, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, until they were deemed sufficiently remorseful. This form of discipline relied on emotional withdrawal rather than confrontation, teaching children that connection and attention were privileges that could be revoked at any time. Parents believed this encouraged reflection and respect, but in reality, it often left children confused, isolated, and unsure how to repair the relationship. Today, enforced silence is recognized as a form of emotional punishment with significant psychological consequences, but at the time it was considered calm, controlled, and even mature parenting. Children learned quickly that their voices were conditional, something to be earned back through compliance rather than communication. Number 7. Punishment without explanation. One of the defining features of discipline in Britain back then was the complete absence of explanation. Children were punished not because they understood what they had done wrong, but because they had broken a rule they were expected to know instinctively. There was no conversation, no clarification, no opportunity to ask questions, because obedience mattered far more than understanding. Parents believed that explaining rules weakened authority, and that children should simply accept consequences without argument. From a modern perspective, this approach is deeply flawed, but at the time it reinforced a clear hierarchy, one in which adults commanded and children complied. Many adults now look back and realize that they often learned fear rather than morality, avoiding punishment rather than understanding why behavior mattered. Number 8. Being told pain was good for you. Pain, whether physical or emotional, was often justified as beneficial, framed as something that would toughen children up for a difficult world. Phrases like, "It'll do you good," or "You'll thank me later," were commonly used to dismiss distress, reinforcing the idea that suffering built character. This belief was deeply embedded in British culture, shaped by wartime experiences, economic hardship, and a general distrust of emotional vulnerability. Today, we recognize that pain does not automatically lead to resilience, but back then, enduring discomfort was seen as preparation for adulthood. Children were expected to cope quietly because complaining was interpreted as weakness rather than a call for support. Number 9. Normalizing fear as obedience. For many children, obedience was not driven by respect or understanding, but by fear, and this was not considered a failure of parenting, but a sign that discipline was working. Fear kept children quiet, compliant, and cautious, traits that parents valued highly in a society that prioritized order and conformity. The absence of rebellion was seen as success, even if it came at the cost of emotional expression or trust. Today, parenting has shifted towards fostering safety and communication, but back then, fear was an accepted, even encouraged motivator. Looking back, many adults recognize that they behaved well, not because they agreed with rules, but because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. Number 10. Being told you were lucky it wasn't worse. Perhaps the most effective way to shut down any protest was comparison. Children were reminded constantly that others had it worse, that they should be grateful, and that questioning discipline was a sign of entitlement. This logic dismissed feelings entirely, replacing empathy with perspective and teaching children that their experiences did not warrant discussion. Today, this approach is widely criticized for invalidating emotions, but back then, it was seen as grounding, a way of teaching humility and acceptance. Children learn not to complain, not to reflect, and not to challenge authority, because doing so was framed as ingratitude rather than curiosity. None of these practices were usually carried out with cruelty in mind, and most parents genuinely believed they were doing the right thing with the knowledge and cultural norms they had at the time. But looking back, it becomes clear that discipline was often less about guidance and more about control, less about teaching and more about obedience. And perhaps the most striking realization is not that these things happened, but that for a long time, nobody thought to ask whether they should have. If this video brought back memories, or if it made you reflect on how much parenting has changed, share your thoughts below, because the conversation around these experiences is still unfolding, even decades later.